On the evening of July 4, 1889, London Police Inspector Frederick Abberline, whose name was already shrouded in dark fame due to the exhausting and fruitless search for Jack the Ripper in the Whitechapel slums, slowly approached an unremarkable brick building. This was number 19 Cleveland Street, located in the Marylebone district. In that stuffy summer moment, the experienced detective hardly realized that by stepping over the threshold of this establishment, he was opening the door to a true political abyss, capable of engulfing the British monarchy whole. At first glance, the operational task seemed a routine episode, related to a breach of public order and the activities of a dubious den. However, behind the modest façade, behind heavy curtains and locked doors, lay a network of contacts whose threads stretched to the very pinnacles of Victorian society, penetrating through ministry walls and reaching the chambers of Buckingham Palace. The prerequisites for this grand scandal began to form several weeks before the police visit, and in the most unexpected place, within the walls of the British General Post Office. It all started with the mundane theft of several shillings missing from the post office till. During the internal investigation, suspicion fell on a 15-year-old messenger named Charles Swinskow. The youth behaved with defiant self-confidence for a mere courier, and when searched, he was found with a sum significantly exceeding his annual salary. When inspectors pressed the youth against the wall with stern questions, he, fearing severe punishment, revealed a secret that should have remained in the thick shadow of the gas lamps of London's outskirts. Young Charles Swinskow spoke of a strange house on Cleveland Street, where young men working as postal couriers received generous compensation for services far beyond the delivery of letters and telegrams. In the closed, emphatically puritanical society of the 19th century, where such connections were considered not merely deeply immoral, but also prosecuted by law as criminal offenses, this confession became a true spark in a powder keg. The police realized that they were facing not just a random violation, but an organized system involving civil servants and people whose names could make any respectable Englishman shudder. The British Empire at the end of the 19th century was at the zenith of its external power, but its internal stability rested on the extremely fragile foundation of strict public morality and the inviolable, almost religious authority of the Crown. Queen Victoria was for the nation a living embodiment of family values, a symbol of indestructible virtue and order. Any shadow cast upon her loved ones or the dignity of her government was perceived not merely as personal disgrace, but as a direct existential threat to the entire state system. When the police began conducting the first searches and interrogations at the house of Charles Hammond, the owner of the establishment on Cleveland Street, the names that surfaced in the testimonies of frightened witnesses caused a state close to complete stupor among the highest officials of Scotland Yard. Among the regular patrons of the clandestine establishment were not only minor officials and army officers, but also representatives of the highest hereditary aristocracy. One of the first to be implicated was Lord Arthur Somerset, a man of impeccable lineage and high standing, who served as equerry to the Prince of Wales himself. His presence in the case materials was already a catastrophe, but the situation continued to escalate with each passing hour. It became clear that Lord Somerset was merely an intermediary, providing access to entertainment for an even more significant personage. Rumors that began circulating in the narrow, smoke-filled offices of Whitehall pointed to a man whose title made ministers blanch and despair. The person in question was Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, Queen Victoria's eldest grandson and second in line to the British throne. Prince Eddie, as he was affectionately and somewhat ironically called within the family, had always been considered a young man with undefined interests, a certain intellectual sluggishness, and a penchant for dubious company. However, involvement in a scandal of such caliber threatened to transform him from merely an irresponsible heir into the chief enemy of public morality and a catalyst for a Republican revolution. The government understood that if the prince's name were to be mentioned in court, the edifice of British statehood could collapse under the weight of public indignation. The investigation immediately encountered an invisible, yet absolutely insurmountable wall erected by the country's highest leadership. As soon as the investigation approached the circle of the prince's closest friends and assistants, the mechanisms of the state machine worked to defeat and conceal the facts. Lord Somerset, contrary to all the iron rules of British justice of the time, was effectively allowed to leave the country unimpeded, even before an official warrant for his arrest was issued. This escape to Europe was not the cowardice of a private individual, but a carefully planned and organized action to save the prestige of the ruling dynasty. The government of Prime Minister Lord Salisbury was acutely aware of the gravity of the moment. If Lord Somerset had stood in the dock in London, he would inevitably have begun to testify to save his life and reputation. In the course of the inquiry, the truth about Prince Albert Victor's visits to the house on Cleveland Street would have become public knowledge, which, in the context of a growing workers' movement and Republican sentiments in the country, was tantamount to the monarchy's political self-elimination. Therefore, the state machine preferred to violate the law for the sake of preserving the very essence of power. While Lord Somerset was hiding in cozy hotels in France and Germany, British justice, to satisfy the public's demand for fairness, focused on small and defenseless targets. Young postal couriers, many of whom were still teenagers who had become unwitting participants in this grim drama, were brought to trial. The trials were conducted in an atmosphere of strict secrecy, behind closed doors, and the press received only those meager scraps of information that had been carefully filtered and could not compromise the upper echelons. But London is a city of rumors, and society clearly felt the falseness of what was happening. In the closed clubs of Piccadilly and in the bustling markets of the East End, whispers circulated that the law in England was harsh only on the poor, while princes of the blood were forgiven absolutely everything. This social schism became the first, most visible layer of a deep conflict. Outwardly, the confrontation looked like an attempt by the police to cleanse the city of vice. But in reality, it was a complex and cynical chess game between the police, the free press, and the government. The North London Press newspaper, under the leadership of the radical editor Ernest Park, tried to break through the information blockade. Park, risking his career and freedom, openly accused the authorities of concealing the names of high-ranking criminals. He wrote that justice in Britain resembled a capricious lady who closes her eyes when friends of the crown are involved. These publications caused a bombshell effect, but the system's response was instantaneous and devastating. Ernest Park was prosecuted for defamation. The journalist's trial turned into a show trial. He was sentenced to 12 months in prison, which served as a harsh and unequivocal warning to all other members of the press. This was a clear lesson in what happens to those who try to seek the truth where it is reliably hidden behind national security interests. After Park's imprisonment, most major publications preferred to remain silent, fearing a similar fate, and the topic of Cleveland Street gradually began to disappear from the front pages, moving into the realm of legends and speculation. The internal conflict of the participants in this drama was no less painful and destructive. For the young Prince Albert Victor, this situation became a profound personal catastrophe. His life was already a subject of constant, agonizing worry for Queen Victoria and the Prince of Wales. Eddie was perceived as a weak, unreliable link in the chain of succession, a man devoid of will and a clear understanding of his mission. There is ample evidence that his behavior during those anxious days bordered on complete nervous exhaustion. He was trapped between his hidden inclinations and a heavy duty to a vast empire, which demanded of him to be an impeccable model of masculinity, dignity, and family purity. The silence imposed on the prince by numerous advisors and family members turned him into a spineless shadow of his own title. He was deprived of the opportunity to justify himself or even explain himself, if such an opportunity had even existed within the rigid etiquette of the time. Albert Victor became a hostage to a system that protected his name but slowly destroyed him as a person. He saw his friends exiled from the country, simple couriers sent to penal servitude, and understood that all these sacrifices were made only so that he could continue to wear a crown that, with each passing day, became a heavier and more hateful burden. Lord Arthur Somerset, in turn, experienced the personal drama of a loyal ally thrown overboard at the first storm. In his desperate letters from exile, he noted with undisguised bitterness that he had become a convenient scapegoat for the salvation of those who stood immeasurably higher than him in the social hierarchy. Somerset never denied his presence at the house on Cleveland Street, but he relentlessly emphasized the monstrous hypocrisy of the state system. His case was unique. The authorities actually helped him escape, providing him with finances and documents just so he would never again cross the English Channel and would not dare to name the prince in a courtroom. Somerset's letters are the cry of a man who suddenly realized that all his aristocratic honor, his service, and his loyalty were merely tools in the hands of dispassionate political pragmatists. He lived the rest of his long life in sad wanderings across Europe, far from his homeland, family, and usual circle of acquaintances. He became a living, walking reminder of the terrible price one sometimes has to pay for the dubious privilege of being admitted to the circle of the heir to the throne's closest friends. His figure forever remained in the shadow of this conspiracy, symbolizing the underside of Victorian splendor. The ideological conflict of this case was rooted in the very core of Victorian mentality. Two completely different Britons clashed on the narrow sidewalks of Cleveland Street. One was official, prim, living by the immutable laws of the Bible, strict rules of etiquette, and emphasized dignity. The other was hidden, nocturnal, forbidden, where all social boundaries and class barriers blurred in the search for thrills and secret pleasures. The scandal exposed a deep, painful contradiction between the social contract preached by the elite and the real private life of that very elite. If the monarchy in England at that time justified its right to existence not only by tradition but also by divine right, as well as its role as the nation's moral leader, then such revelations undermined the very foundation of the legitimacy of power. The fundamental question that hung in the air was, can an institution claiming to be the spiritual and moral compass of a vast colonial empire continue to exist if its main pillars openly violate the laws they themselves established? This was a conflict between the idea of the sanctity of power and the reality of human weakness, a conflict that threatened to escalate into an open confrontation between the people and the crown. The transformation in the perception of this complex case occurred at the critical moment when the highest echelons of the executive branch became involved. The British Attorney General and the Home Secretary personally oversaw the investigation to ensure that not a single detail, no matter how insignificant, that could cast a shadow on the prince leaked into the public court records. Secret documents from those years, discovered by historians many decades later, show an incredible, almost unprecedented level of coordinated efforts to disinformation and suppress information. Entire pages of witness testimonies, which contained descriptions of a person remarkably similar to the Queen's grandson, were removed or physically destroyed. This was the moment of a definitive and irreversible shift from classical justice to a strategy of protecting state interests at all costs. The system stopped seeking the truth and focused solely on survival. Faith in the impartiality of the British court was sacrificed for the tranquility of the ruling house. It was during this period that the conspiracy of silence was formed, which for decades enveloped the history of Cleveland Street in an impenetrable fog, turning a real criminal case into a semi-mythical legend. An unexpected and dramatic turn in history occurred when public attention, fueled by rumors, began to shift from the very fact of immoral behavior by individuals to the methods by which the government attempted to conceal the truth. This instantly transformed the scandal from a private moral and ethical incident into a sharp political crisis. Radical members of Parliament began to publicly ask extremely uncomfortable questions about how taxpayers' money was being spent on maintaining a police force that, instead of fighting crime, was secretly escorting aristocrats to the state border. The system, in a hasty attempt to extinguish one local fire, unwittingly ignited another, far more dangerous one, a systemic crisis of trust in all key institutions of power. Society began to realize that behind the façade of democratic procedures and equality before the law lay a rigid hierarchy, where proximity to the throne granted indulgence for any deeds. This shift in public consciousness became a long-term time bomb under the authority of the British aristocracy, which began to lose its position to the growing power of the middle class and professional politicians. The culmination of all these events came at the very beginning of the 1890s. Despite all titanic efforts to suppress it, the shadow of Cleveland Street continued to relentlessly follow Prince Albert Victor wherever he went. In social circles, his reputation was hopelessly tarnished, and his future as monarch caused serious concerns for the cabinet. The hasty engagement of the prince to Princess Mary of Teck, arranged by Queen Victoria herself, was seen by contemporaries as a desperate attempt to underscore, quote, underscore, 0, underscore, and stabilize the heir's position in the eyes of his subjects, creating the image of an exemplary family man. However, fate intervened, disposing of matters in the most decisive way. In January 1892, in the midst of active preparations for a lavish wedding, Prince Eddie suddenly ended his earthly journey. The official cause was the then raging influenza epidemic, complicated by pneumonia. His death at the age of 28 became the final tragic point in the official history of the great scandal. With the death of the main protagonist, around whom all threads of the investigation were tied, the urgent need for active and aggressive concealment of facts gradually disappeared. The case was finally sent to the archives under the secret classification, and witnesses either fell silent forever or left the country. This sudden resolution brought enormous relief to the royal family and the entire government, but it left the question of the true truth open and bleeding. The prince's younger brother, the future King George V, took his place not only in the line of succession to the throne, but also in the heart of his fiancée, Mary of Teck, thereby ensuring the continuity and stability of the dynasty for many decades to come. The monarchy as an institution endured, successfully weathering the storm, sacrificing the reputations of several young messengers, the career of an editor, and the honor of one devoted lord. The sacredness of the crown was saved at the cost of a great lie. Nevertheless, the resonance of this case was felt in Britain for many generations. The Cleveland Street scandal became a harbinger of the final decline of the Victorian era, with its rigid moral censorship and double standards. It clearly showed that even the highest and most protected palace walls could no longer completely isolate power from the changing standards of transparency and public scrutiny. In the long term, this led to the democratization of British politics and a change in the role of the monarchy, which became more open and dependent on public opinion. Today, more than a century later, the Cleveland Street story is analyzed by leading historians as a classic, almost exemplary case of a state conspiracy undertaken to preserve the political status quo. It teaches us that information has always been the most valuable and at the same time the most dangerous resource. The lessons of this old scandal remain strikingly relevant in our time, when the boundaries between the private lives of public figures and their professional obligations are becoming increasingly illusory and thin under the pressure of digital technologies and social media. We see how the same mechanisms of information suppression and public opinion manipulation that were used in the 19th century anticipated modern reputation management methods in an era of crises. However, this story also serves as a powerful reminder that truth possesses a unique quality. It inevitably breaks through any barriers, through decades and even centuries of deliberate silence. Archival findings of the late 20th century confirmed many suspicions of Prince Eddie's contemporaries, proving that history always finds a way to tell its true self. This story is not just a gloomy chronicle of an underground establishment in Victorian London, but a complex mirror in which the fears, ambitions, and deep vices of an entire great era were fully reflected. It shows how far state power can go in its sincere or selfish desire to protect its idealized image, and what an exorbitantly high price is always paid by those who, by chance, find themselves in the path of so-called higher state interests. Ultimately, the conspiracy of silence around Prince Albert Victor became not just an attempt to conceal the human weaknesses of one particular person, but a large-scale battle for the very survival of the idea of monarchy in a rapidly changing world. Mentally returning to that stuffy July night when Inspector Abberline confidently entered house number 19, we now clearly see the beginning of the long end of the old world order. What began as a minor, almost insignificant police inquiry into missing shillings from the till, by force of circumstance, turned into a grand historical drama, where nothing less than the British throne and the future of the entire empire were at stake. The dust on the archival folders of the Cleveland Street scandal may conceal many specific names and faces, but it cannot conceal the most important thing: that critical moment when a great empire faltered in the face of its own shadow. The figure of Prince Eddie, forever frozen in history as a sad symbol of an unfulfilled, tragic, and deeply contradictory future, remains for us an eternal reminder of an important truth. Behind any, even the most brilliant and majestic facade, there are always ordinary human passions, mistakes, and weaknesses that can instantly change the course of world history. This narrative completes its cycle, returning us to a deep understanding that the true history of mankind is written not only in solemn manifestos, at the tables of peace conferences, or on the fields of great battles. It is also created in dark, inconspicuous alleys, in quiet offices, and behind the closed doors of private homes, where the accidental confession of a frightened young man can deliver a deadly blow to centuries-old tradition and make kings tremble. Looking today at the formal portraits of that distant era, we learn to see not only the grandeur and power of the empire, but also the hidden anxiety lurking in the eyes of those who knew the bitter truth and, despite everything, chose the path of long silence. Their difficult choice allowed the monarchy to exist in its unchanged form for a long time, but it also laid the very seeds of doubt that inevitably sprouted in the new century, forever and irrevocably changing the fundamental relationship between the people, the law, and supreme power. The Cleveland Street tragedy is a story of how one small lie, designed to save grandeur, gradually turns into a massive wall behind which the true face of power is hidden. And although Prince Albert Victor never became king, his short life and the scandal associated with it left a much deeper mark on British history than the reign of many other monarchs. It is a trace of the collision of human nature with the soulless machine of state prestige, a collision in which there are no winners, but only lessons that we continue to comprehend to this day. In every document of that time, in every crossed-out line of testimony, one can feel the breath of an era that desperately tried to keep its secrets, not realizing that these very secrets would eventually become its most vivid and honest monument. Postal couriers delivering letters all over London ultimately delivered something much more explosive: the realization that behind the glitter of gold and the silk of palaces lay the same conflicts and sufferings as in the poorest quarters of the city. This connection, which arose against the will of the Queen and ministers, became the first step towards breaking down the invisible walls that divided British society. And today, Cleveland Street is not just an address on the map of London, but a symbol of a moment of truth when the empire was forced to look in the mirror and see there not only its pride, but also its fear. This story teaches us that there is no secret that will not become apparent, and no grandeur that will not be tested by truth, no matter how bitter and dangerous it may seem at the moment. Closing this page of history, we understand that the conspiracy of silence ultimately lost to time itself. Time is the most impartial judge, who knows no estates and does not obey the orders of ministers. It delivered its verdict, preserving for us the details of the Cleveland Street case not as a reason for condemnation, but as an important fragment of the mosaic of the human path. A path on which every choice made in the shadows sooner or later comes to light, forcing us to look anew at what we call historical heritage and national dignity. The monarchy survived, but it ceased to be the same forever, losing a particle of its inviolability on that very evening when the first inspector knocked on the door of house number 19.